So everybody, welcome to another game design lecture, series here on the channel. For this month's topic, I figured we're going to talk about that ever popular term of roguelike design, or what is a rogue, as a Shark has already done in, a negative time. So for these discussions, I'm still trying to figure out how I want to relate them more to the Patreon. So I think for right now, I'll be editing this piece, including some of the transfers from game to game and some of the extra questions, and leaving the kind of uncut for the Patreon subscribers. And if you have any suggestions for more things, let me know in the comments below. But we finally got the chat kind of looking somewhat easy to follow down there. And let's see where things go. I have my list of notes as well for what I want to talk about. So, to begin with, let's talk a little bit more about what is a rogue. Again, I think Shark beat me to it. And roguelike design has certainly come a long way since the origination or the beginning of the genre back in the early 80s with Rogue, which then transitioned to hack and then NetHack. And it led to, I think, a very interesting discussion about what is a roguelike, as well as whether or not that term can be applied to a lot of games today. And we'll go more into that topic probably in our final section for this piece. But to begin with, in terms of what kind of constitutes rogue and roguelike design in general, the basics of the genre are that we're dealing with a game that has procedural and random elements. We'll talk more about what that means in the next section. There is a focus on variance, or on runs, meaning that while there is an end, it's not necessarily an end as in you beat the game, you turn it off, and you never play it again. A lot of what makes rogues or makes roguelike design popular is this idea that you're going to be replaying this game and getting different runs and different opportunities or things that can happen. Again, the footage that you're seeing over there is obviously from Spelunky, and one of the biggest proponents of procedural design with these kinds of games. Now, roguelikes, again, we've seen kind of the push and pull of having permadeath, or hardcore or semi-hardcore design. And you don't know what that term means. Hardcore means that when you die, the run is over, all progress is wiped, and you begin again on your next run, basically back at zero. Now, we've seen more games push for persistence as a major element of replayability and more content. And again, we'll come back to that in a later part of this lecture here. But one of the things that I think made the genre a lot harder to get into was this idea of permadeath. Because people don't like it when you tell them that when you die, you lose everything, go back to zero. And it's one of the reasons why, for the longest time, the genre kind of remained very much niche. Now, despite that, me taking a lot of drinks, so I'm very thirsty. Despite that, there were examples of games that, while they weren't really RPG, they had elements of rogue in them. So, this is Toe Jam Earl back in the groove, but it is essentially a spiritual successor to the original game. And if we were to be very specific, we could argue that games like Toe Jam and Earl were really one of the first examples of roguelike design. One of the arguments that a lot of people have had is that when they look at roguelikes, but when we look at rogues, or the idea of a roguelike, many people adhere to the classical term, or the classical definitions, meaning that it is turn-based, typically played from an isometric point of view, and you're essentially playing it in a WeGo style. Which, for those of you who don't know what that term means, WeGo is a form of turn-based strategy or turn-based design where both the player and all enemies on the screen will move at the same time. We see this in kind of squad-based tactical games such as Door Kickers, Laser Squad Nemesis, and we see in a lot of single character controlling roguelikes. Shiren the Wanderer, I think it was Tanglewood, I think that was the name of it. Hyper Rogue, and there's other ones as well. But for something like ToeJam and Earl, we have a lot of the DNA of the roguelike genre. We have a procedurally generated world, we have rewards and challenges and events being completely randomized, and when you die you go back to zero. But the big differing point, of course, is that this is not a turn-based game, as you're seeing me move very much rapidly across in that footage. And this is where that kind of argument, or where we started to get into that splitting hairs territory of, are roguelikes still belong, or does that term still belong to games like ToeJam and Earl, or should it belong to games that are more classical in its design? And then that is where the idea of this, of a sub to the subgenre, the roguelite, comes into play. And I'm sure Shark will ask what's a roguelite in the comments in the next like 10 seconds. But what we have here is Sparklight. This was a game that we played late last year. And roguelite, despite many people using this as a way of trolling developers and what they're doing, that was starting to annoy, I think, my OCD there with getting these streams up. But roguelite is something that we refer to games that have random or procedural elements, but it deals more with having a fixed end. And what that typically means is that when we look at a roguelike, you are able to play this game multiple times. There's a focus on runs, such as with FTL, Spelunky, Convoy, and many others. With a roguelite, there is an explicit end to this game. There is a point where you are supposed to beat this game, and then you're done, unless there's a new game plus or a harder mode that becomes unlocked. Rogue Legacy is another example of this, as well as Children of Morta. With Sparklight, what they do is that when you go back to the actual game, and this is the kind of hub element you're in right now, when you start playing, the world is procedurally generated out of handmade elements or hard-coded points, but you have a major goal to this game. There are points of interest that you can kind of make out on the map there that you are supposed to visit. In this game, I think it's 4 dungeons. Everything else on the map doesn't necessarily matter. And these games are typically don't have a lot of random or procedural elements that create variance. Instead, you are focusing on kind of the persistent elements. In this game, it's getting enough resources to unlock new badges or increase space. In Rogue Legacy, it was upgrading your base character or unlocking new classes. And the same goes for something like Hades. That despite Hades having a strong focus on additional plays, it's still very much built on that persistence. Now, the persistence difference between a game like Sparklight and The Binding of Isaac is that the persistence in The Binding of Isaac unlocks new elements that will show up on subsequent runs, but you're still focusing on the runs themselves. And again, one of the easiest ways to tell whether or not a game is a roguelike or a roguelite is that, is there a focus on the persistence of your character? Meaning, can we kind of chart kind of the progression or the power curve of a character between run 1, run 10, run 50, and so on? With a game like Enter the Gungeon, one of the reasons why a lot of people like it is very much the fact that when you're playing Enter the Gungeon, it is entirely skill oriented. Even though there is persistence in terms of new guns and events that become available, you still have to be the one in control. And it doesn't really matter what guns drop or what events you get if you're not good at the game. And again, this is where the term get good, I think, has kind of come into play. And it's the same thing with a game like Monolith. Monolith has a lot of persistence, similar to the Binding of Isaac of unlocking new content. But at the end of the day, if you're not good at the game, it doesn't matter what the game drops. Whereas in a game like Rogue Legacy, Sparklight, Hades, even if you are not the best player, thank you, Shark. That's great to have it on a lecture right there. But doesn't matter how, if you're a horrible player at a game like Hades or Sparklight or some of the other examples, eventually the persistent elements are going to kind of overtake or supplement your skill. With something like Sparklight, actually, I'm going to fast forward to near the end of the game. One of the things that I ran into with Sparklight is the fact that the enemy's overall power grows between the areas. And this is a game where an enemy can easily do 3 or 4 hearts worth of damage as you get near the end of the game, especially the heavier enemies. So what the game does to compensate is it allow you to equip more armor on your character. And this is a very big deal, because the final boss has some very cheap or very janky attacks that can wreck you even if you do have a good eye towards dodging. So what ended up happening was that we did this run. I'm going to fast forward a little bit more here. We did this run on stream, and the final boss just wrecked me very quickly in terms of its damage output. Now, of course, given enough skill, I think I could have beaten him even with the deficit. But what I did was, after this the stream was over, I found out that I had quests that I could turn in, and I got the very best armor badges in the game. So what ended up happening was that instead of the boss doing like 1 to 2 hearts worth of damage to me per hit, he was doing 1/4 of a heart of damage. And that was huge. And I've said this before, that with a lot of roguelites, you can't give me overpowered builds, because I will break those games when that happens. We saw it with Hades when I got the bow with a multi-shot with a crit chance per multi-hit, and I was just dominating that run. And you guys saw it when that happened on stream. I think we had our first actual live win in Hades on Hell mode with that play. But the point is that when you're differentiating between a roguelike and a roguelite, my hands just completely went in the wrong direction there. With a roguelite, given enough time and the persistence, a player is going to basically be able to overtake the game. But the problem with that kind of design is that with a roguelite, you are typically not able to win on your early runs, because the game is inherently bound around that persistent element. And again, we'll come back to that in a later point in this lecture here. As we have that lovely footage of Dark Souls 3 running on the side, the term Soulslike, or Soulslite, or however we want to describe it, kind of became its own little vernacular over the past decade with the popularity of the From Software series. And while it does feature some roguelike or roguelite elements, it is not a rogue or anywhere in that design at all. Typically when we talk about a Soulslike or Soulslike, I'm just going to say Soulslike just so I won't keep slurring my speech there. Soulslikes deal with handmade or hard-coded worlds. Again, with the From Software series, every blade of grass, every jump, every item placement is handmade. The only small exception to that rule was Bloodborne with the Chalice dungeons. But a Souls-like typically has as its main form of punishment, or its main form of progression, a heavy focus on unlocking permanent shortcuts or areas through the game. When you die, you go back to your previous checkpoint, but any areas that you unlocked remain open. So the general idea is, I'm going to push through an area to try and get to the next shortcut. When I get to that next shortcut, it will now make that previous area either easy or easier or mitigate it. Now if I can fast forward here, this was, I can't believe I'm going to piss off all the Souls fans, but I forget the name of the area that we're in. But in this area, A major part of the progress is unlocking the major city gates, which will lead up to the temple where you fight. Oh no, I forgot his name too. I'll show the footage of it in a minute. You'll see me get killed to him. But when we talk about a Souls-like, there is persistence in the character level by obviously you leveling up your character. Every time you level up, it'll raise your core stats. And what they do in the From Software games is that you get very little impact on the stats, with exception to being able to wield weapons. But it all kind of grows over the course of playing the game. If you can look at my health, magic, and stamina bar over there, if I were to fast forward really fast, like near the end of this footage, you're going to see a massive leap, probably, as you can see right there, in terms of how much health that I had. And when we talk about, and I'm actually going to rewind back, and hopefully I get that footage back of me fighting. Is that it? There we go. There he goes, Pontiff Solivan. Again, not easy to pronounce these names. But getting to the Pontiff here requires you to open up at least 2 or 3 major checkpoints and shortcuts. And of course, when you die, the world around the player resets. That's where I think the confusion about Souls-like and how they refer to roguelikes come into play. Because again, with a roguelike, when you die, the world resets and you start back at 0. But in that case, the world is being randomly or procedurally generated to present a new run. In a Dark Souls or Souls-like kind of game, when you die, you basically get that same world. So in a way, the Souls-like design is a more approachable roguelike, and we are probably confusing so many new people as we just keep using Souls-like and roguelike almost interchangeably here. But this is one of the reasons why the From Software formula really blew up, almost like akin to the Grand Theft Auto open world sandbox genre of the previous decade. But if we were to put them together, Souls-likes really don't occupy the same kind of design as a roguelike. We could certainly dedicate maybe like a video or maybe like a subpart or a subtop in one of my books to Souls-like design, but it's not often, I don't think it would be considered in the same vein. A key element of whether or not you're doing roguelike, light, and if we want to come with any other definitions, design, is the use of procedural and random generation. Procedural generation is the act of the game creating a space with original layouts or design. Well, that in the small scale, we have something like the Binding of Isaac. With Binding of Isaac, as well as, Monolith, and I think a few others, each room that you're seeing on the screen right now is 100% handmade, from where the items are placed to what obstacles are shown. What isn't handmade is where they show up in a level, as well as what enemies or items that will drop after that room is over. So right here we have a random event. And with the Binding of Isaac, what makes the game kind of stand the test of time is the sheer amount of variance that can come about with procedural generation along these lines. As a player, I don't know what I'm going to get, but the game is kind of hard-coding. The algorithm that's used for level and biome generation is a big point or a big part of that. Each set of floors corresponds to a biome. That biome then is broken down to what enemies or rooms that can show up. So as a player, not necessarily. I've seen runs where getting the wrong room or getting the wrong enemy layout can easily screw you. Now, for some of the runs of Binding of Isaac, like when we talk about, I think, certain boss rooms or certain boss floors, the game will pick from a pool of those enemies. Now, with that said, though, it's kind of hard to tell whether or not the rooms are hand-picked in terms of enemies. Now, when I play it on the hard difficulty, I also get elite variations that kind of muddy things up even more. Now, one thing that I am not sure of, and this will be something I would have to, if we can ever get Ed McMillan back on, I would have to ask him, are there copies of rooms, but they have different enemy placements? Because there are some cases that there are rooms that the enemy loadout is kind of consistent. For instance, there is a room on the mom section, or the womb, where you have kind of 2 rows of those kind of tentacle enemies, and then you have the eyeballs shooting lasers. And whenever that room shows up, it is kind of is hard-coded, or it seems to be hard-coded, what enemies show up. Another room is a very long horizontal room, and you get like 10 different bat enemies that show up on the left side, and they move their way over. So I do think there are rooms that the enemies are hand-picked. But for the majority of the rooms, it does seem to be random. Now, there are games that will just 100% have those enemies randomized. And Monolith, I think, does that for some of its rooms, but it also has those handmade points. But it's a case where there are so many rooms that have been hand-built. You're saying that it's more random enemies? Because again, it's kind of hard to tell without getting the developer on or being able to look behind the scenes. So you're saying that the enemies are hand-picked. And again, it could just be a case of so many rooms that it could also kind of muddy the results for me as well. But switching examples to a game that does things a little bit more fast and loose. But when we switch footage over here to Dead Cells, Dead Cells is a game that the procedural content really is a lot more fast and loose compared to Binding of Isaac, but it doesn't have as much in way of variance in terms of how things play out. When you're not playing the game on the harder difficulties, each biome has a preset choice of what enemies will show up. For instance, when you get to the sewers here, you're going to be seeing a lot of these slug enemies, those annoying mushroom enemies, and the primary obstacle is going to be the acid or poison that you see right there. And this is a key element about procedural design, that the algorithm is picking from handmade or hand-chosen elements by a developer, and then using that when it's generating the levels. Now, with that said though, let me keep that footage there. Procedural design is, like we say, cornerstone of these games. But a lot of procedural-based designs will feature random generation. And the difference between random and procedural generation is that procedural generation will create something basically out of scratch. ARPGs that make use of loot tables feature procedural generation in terms of how gear is designed, and why in a good ARPG, no 2 pieces of gear that drops, even if they are like legendary or elite class, are going to be 100% the same. Random generation is about taking handmade elements and shuffling them around in the game space. This is where this idea of points of interest on a map come into play. This is Darkwood. It's a game that I think a few of the regulars are well aware of this game because we've played it several times on stream. I really like the basic concept of it as kind of a roguelike or roguelite horror game. But how Darkwood works is that when you start a new game, the world is procedurally generated, but it uses random generation in terms of placement of the points of interest. There are elements on this map that are handmade. The village, your various safe houses or safe homes, the farm, and major events like that. So where the world is procedurally generated, the random or the hard code elements are randomly placed, and then within those places, that is 100% fixed. And random generation, we can certainly have its own lecture, I think, on random and procedural generation. But typically for roguelikes, you're making more use of procedural generation. Again, the Binding of Isaac, Enter the Gungeon, and like we said, probably the standout example of procedural generation would be Spelunky. Because those levels are 100% made original every time you start a new run. Now, with that said though, the random side of things comes into place where hard code elements will show up. Because again, when I play a game like Darkwood here, I know what I'm looking for in the world. I'm looking for these safe homes, these points of interest. Once I get there, everything that goes into that is going to be kind of preordained. I know what to expect. Another example that is really good, let me just pull up my notes here really fast, would be Don't Starve. And we'll talk more about Don't Starve in the next section here. But typically, if you're going to build a game around procedural random generation, it is a ton of work. And like we've said before, a game that is 100% kind of completely up in the air in terms of its design is not going to be the best roguelike. There has to be control. And if you guys remember who are on the Discord, we did that. I showed you that article on Gamma Sutra where the person was arguing that roguelikes are just 100%, up in the air, nothing is planned, and that is wrong. There has to be some semblance or some control. What we see in a lot of roguelike and roguelite design is that if this is the start point, as we radiate out from that start point, you're going to see harder elements or challenges. If, the first room features an enemy who's level 1, the 5th room may feature an enemy who's level 6. And the gear and the rewards will adjust accordingly. But the idea that using procedural or random generation just means throw everything in the game and call it a day doesn't hold water. Even with Darkwood over here, the game is inherently designed that each one of these the three biomes in the first chapter get progressively difficult. For those of you who watch me do the live stream, when you get to biome 3, you run into these red enemies that they will wreck you if you're not prepared for it. But I think with that, when we talk about procedural and random generation, it all builds towards a major point about roguelike design. And that is the magical word variance. And variance I think will be the word of the day for our lecture here. Variance is a very important term when it comes to roguelike and roguelite design. You may get your monkey's paw wish if they go more towards a battle royale. But variance is what I use to define the number of ways the game can legitimately create different runs in a game. And actually, Dead Cells would be more for persistence, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Variance simply means, again, how many ways can I challenge the player and make it different? Variance provides multiple ways of having different runs. And like we said, not just different in terms of shuffling up levels, but making them feel like it's a different game. And this again is why good, Shark's doing advertising there. But this is one of the key elements of roguelike design, that I should be able to have a legitimately different experience on run 1 as I do on run 10, run 50, run 100, and so on. This is why, like for Mike there, who's played over 1,500 hours of Binding of Isaac, I think I'm up to several hundred at the moment just because I play so many games. These games keep people coming back to it. I know Shark has played extensively a lot of FTL. The idea is that even though the basics of this game are going to stay consistent, there is enough variability in how the game generates the space and what can show up that I don't know what is going to happen. In Enter the Gungeon here, as I said, even though the game is very skill dependent, I still have to be surprised. Well, I have no life, but I have to play these games because I have to write and talk about them. But even though a game like Enter the Gungeon is still skill dependent, the amount of variance means that I have to roll with the punches. And a key point about variance, and this is going to be our drinking game, how many times I say it in this section, is that I can pivot when I play a game that has a good amount of variance to it. With Enter the Gungeon, all it takes is one different gun or different passive, and my entire run is changed. The same thing goes for Binding of Isaac, as anyone can attest to when they get Brimstone or Dr. Fetus, or unfortunately something like soy milk or lemonade or something like that. That the runs themselves will change greatly. And this is a key point about the difference between a roguelike and a roguelite. That with a roguelite, there's typically not a lot of variance in terms of the individual runs. They focus more on persistence, that we'll come back to in the next section. But when you play a game that is of a roguelite, you're mainly dealing with a lot of elements that are shuffled around, but there are still hard code to what you have to do. In a game like Sundered, every time I start a new run, or every time I die and the game will randomly or procedurally shovel up the world, I still have to focus on getting to the upgrade points, finding the cursed treasures, and getting to bosses. Those elements are consistent. So it doesn't matter how the world is generated if I'm still focusing on A, B, and C. Yep, and again, games that go for a huge amount of variance, you're going to give a lot of different tools for the player to find. The same thing with Enter the Gungeon. They went a step further by actually having named gun combos. That if you get the right passives or the right set of guns, they'll kind of do a Captain Planet by our powers combine action and give you something else. In going back to Hades, again, that in a run I used the bow and arrow combined with the multi-shot, combined with a crit chance, combined with a spread on hit on my multi-shot, and the run was basically over at that point. I didn't need anything else. Now, a key point about variance like this is that you're going to have game-breaking runs. Nobody can tell me that the Binding of Isaac is 100% balanced like that. It wasn't designed to be balanced. But a lot of developers will kind of become afraid of that game-breaking way, and you don't really want to be afraid of that because the chance of it happening is very low. Now again, skill can mitigate it, but at the end of the day though, if the player every 3 runs gets Brimstone, the Mega Fan, and what was it? I can't believe I forget the name of it. What was it? Not the Crucible. The Holy Mantle. There we go. Then there's a problem. The key point about the Binding of Isaac and why it has so much variance is that Edmund has added in so many items over the course of its development that it's grown to that state. And this is why, And this is why the very best examples of these games that have high variance is that they will most often feature expansions that add in supplemental content. And again, that's a topic for another lecture, but very quickly. Supplemental content means that we add in elements that will change a run of a game, but not add to the overall length. So when you play Binding of Isaac, a typical run can be anywhere from 20 minutes to maybe an hour. Again, give or take items and how far you are into the game. What the expansions have done have added in more possibilities or more variables that can show up during that play. But outside of adding in a new level or a new secret event, you're not adding more to that length. If the Binding of Isaac had content like in a typical game, it would make the runs become longer. It could be a 2-hour run, the Binding of Isaac. Monolith recently is a really good example of supplemental content, adding in more room layouts, more events, more enemies that can show up, and more item variables. But again, not ballooning the amount of content or the amount of time it takes to play that game. When we talk about creating random and procedural elements, and again, trying to add variance to a game, not every element that you have that's either randomly or procedurally generated will create variance. They're not all equal. And for lack of better terms, I've gone on to define them as hard and soft elements. A hard element is something that radically changes how you play a run of a game. These are the elements that make you pivot, such as a new biome in a Binding of Isaac, adding in a new boss, a new weapon class in a game. Soft elements shuffle around in between or in each run, but they're not changing how you're going to play that game or your overall strategy. In Don't Starve, the biomes themselves are hard elements. Whether I get the forest biome, the graveyard biome, the pig village, mountain, desert, so on. The soft element is where they show up in the world. This is why procedurally generating the game space just by itself and nothing else does not create variance. Because if I still need to get X, Y, and Z to win the game, whether it's over there, up there, down there, anywhere you want, it's not changing my overall strategy. If you remember, when we did the play of the Swords of Ditto, for instance, which is the closest the game came to trying to be kind of like a Zelda rogue, that while the world is randomly generated, it doesn't necessarily matter because the events that can pop up, as well as the dungeons, those points are fixed. I need those things to happen or I can't make any hard progress. Going back to the Sparklight example from earlier. We'll save that for book number 6. Going back to Sparklight, that even though this world is procedurally generated, the actual things that I have to do in this world are soft elements, or the world itself is softly defined because I'm focusing on those handmade points. The typical problem when we look at games that go entirely on procedural generation without really defining more hard elements is that it's not creating variance. We've played roguelikes and roguelites before, wherein even though I'm getting these different runs, I'm not really changing what I'm doing on a run-by-run basis. If you remember that game, the game I can't remember, the one from Harebrained Schemes, that their roguelike, it was kind of like a Dark Souls-ish kind of game. The problem was that even though the world is randomly generated on play, there weren't enough variables within that place to give me variance. we ran into a similar issue with Invisible Ink, that the hard elements of Invisible Ink were the corporations. They determined what traps you were going to run into, what enemies you were going to have. But the soft elements, the actual world generation, weren't enough to make each play feel different. It basically becomes a case of, once I know how to play the game, I'm not going to have to pivot in terms of my strategy. I can do the same thing on each run, no matter what the game generates. I'm going to still be able to win. Whereas when they add in more corporations or more hard values or hard elements, that changes what I can and can't do, and makes me have more of that variables. And again, an easy way to tell the difference between a soft element and a hard element is the hard element changing how I play or how I approach the game. And you can add soft elements to hard elements. This is where the confusion, or where it gets a little tricky. In Monolith, for instance, a hard element is a new weapon type. That changes what I do. If I get the charge shot, the sword, the laser, that changes my strategy. The soft element are the keywords that become attached to those weapons, because that is not changing the overall purpose of the gun, or not completely. So if I get a tri-laser, a freeze laser, a fire laser, etc., it's still a laser. It still belongs to that core group. So again, with Don't Starve here, a hard element are the biomes. They determine the procedural elements of what the game is going to generate. The soft element is going to be where they show up in the world. So how the world is generated by these various chunks, that is the soft part about it. But the more biomes that get added, that changes what my strategy is going to be going forward. And like we said, typically when we talk about roguelite designs, they don't really do as much in terms of variance, at least not in this same scale of hard and soft. And again, going back to Deadwood, the soft element is the hard element is going to be what events show up. The soft element is where they're going to show up in the world itself. But that is still a very limited factor of it. Are hard elements really needed? Yes. Because the hard elements are going to be what you define your procedural generation. So in Spelunky, each biome is a hard element. It determines what the game is going to generate. If I'm in the temple biome in Spelunky, I know I can expect the spider event, the kind of sacrificial god event, as well as the treasure. The soft elements in Spelunky Spelunky is a very weird example because of how its procedural generation works. Hey, Alberto. But you need to think in terms of hard and soft elements, because that's only going to define what your procedural generation is going to be. And again, this is why a procedural generation is so complicated, because you need to give your algorithm enough handmade elements for it to then create more variance out of it. So to put it another way, when we think about hard elements in an ARPG, they would be the variable modifiers that can show up, and as well as the class types. That, I think, would be not as important. So again, something like a Soulslike, for instance, probably doesn't need hard elements, or a lesser roguelike, or a game that features roguelike elements to it. In that case, we could argue that the hard elements would be whatever kind of rewards the player in that regard, or what you're getting out of it. But yeah, I would say if the game is making use of rogue elements or roguelike elements to it, but isn't really a roguelike, then you don't really need hard elements or hard and soft. But if we are talking about roguelike and roguelite design specifically, then that you need to start thinking about that. In Sundered, for instance, the soft elements would be the world generation, while the hard elements are the actual skill upgrades. But one thing that you've probably noticed, or as we've been talking about this, there are far less or far fewer hard elements in a roguelike or roguelite than there are soft. Because the more hard elements you put into your game, the more that's going to change and give choices. And that also means more things you have to balance. It goes back to the Telltale, that nested tree of choices, that the more you have that matter, the more you want to design around that. And it grows exponentially. And this is why, when we talk about a lot of games that feature supplemental content, they will mostly add in more soft elements or expand on the hard elements that are already in the game. Because again, the more you add in this regard, the harder it's going to ultimately be to balance and add to the algorithm. But this is also why when games do that, it makes things more exciting. So for instance, in a better world that we got more support for invisible ink, what I wanted them to add would be more corporations, as well as more agents. Because the agents themselves are examples of hard elements, because each one gives you a different strategy to that world. A major point about kind of adding in more content, whether it's soft or hard, is that once you add in a new hard element, it gives you more room for those soft, or for more soft elements to it. And this is why a lot of roguelikes will just keep adding in more supplemental content, because it adds more value to that game. Again, with Binding of Isaac, the room layouts, or the actual rooms themselves, you can just keep adding more soft elements once you define what can show up on each biome. But the biomes themselves are the hard elements. So with Binding of Isaac, Edmund McMillan, whoever else will design more levels for that game, they can just keep adding in more rooms and balloon things out, and it's going to create more variance along those lines. But with that said, though, if you focus too much on soft elements, and this is what we often see in roguelites, you're going to end up hurting the variance of the game. Because I know that if the game is hard-coded around specific things, that is going to hurt variance. Where do games like... They would fall more... I haven't, unfortunately, played 7 Days to Die, but I did play Minecraft and Subnautica and Terraria. They have a lot of soft elements to them. Again, the actual layout of the world would be a soft element. The biomes themselves and what can spawn in them would be hard elements like that. So, and this is actually a really good point. One thing that hurts variance is when you have locked elements in your game, meaning fixed things that either have to happen or are going to happen. In Minecraft, the progression curve of Minecraft is a fixed element. You punch a tree to get wood. You use the wood to make a wooden axe and a pickaxe. I dig, or I start mining the ground for rock. I take the rock and I make a stone pickaxe. I take the stone pickaxe to then mine for harder materials. And it just creates this cycle of more and more progression. This is another point about games like FTL. That one thing that I feel hurts FTL to some extent is that it features a fixed endpoint with the boss. The same thing to an even greater extent with Convoy. That I know at the end of FTL what that boss is going to be. And because of that fixed nature, there are specific strategies. Now again, you can get really lucky in FTL just as you can in roguelike and maybe not need them. But when you have a boss that makes use of X strategy, you need the right counter to it. And if you don't get that, you're going to be in trouble. Now, here's the point though, and I'm sure I may beat Shark to the punch here. Why FTL isn't as bad, or why a lot of people enjoy it so much, is the sheer variety of tactics that you can play around with. You can use, for instance, the what was it? The warp, or whatever it's called, the that lets you teleport units onto the enemy ship to deal with the crew members like that. You go for a strategy that has heavy and shields. The point is that you want enough variance that even if there are handmade or hard-code elements, there is still the teleporter. Thank you. You can still have different ways of approaching it. With Biome of Isaac, again, everyone knows that at the end of a normal run of Biome of Isaac, you're going to face Mom. And then you're going to face the Womb. And then if you're really good at the game, you're going to face, what was it? Your Soul or the Cathedral. That if you're going to embrace variance, you must be able to give the game and must create viable runs. One of the complaints that I had about Dead Cells, at least in this iteration of it, I don't know if they're planning on adding in more, but every boss in Dead Cells is a fixed fight. It has a set strategy to it. They have a set way of fighting it. And what ends up happening in Dead Cells is that if you don't have the right build, these fights can become almost near unbeatable for you. The final boss of Dead Cells is a good example of that. And I've had runs fail despite being really, really good because I didn't have the right strategy for that boss. And for anyone who's played roguelikes, you've probably ran into this yourselves, that you'll have a run where 90% of that run is easy, it's straightforward, you're not having any problem. You get to that boss that has the perfect counter, and you are dead. You are deader than dead at that point. And it can be very frustrating because of this. Slay the Spire is another example of this. If you, for instance, have a deck strategy in Slay the Spire that is built heavily on card draw, and you run into the Time Eater, he flat out counters you. Sure, you can attest to what happened to me in Rise of the Slime, where if I have a fire-based build and I run into an enemy or a boss that is completely fire immune, guess what? I am dead. Like, I am literally dead. There is no way for me to beat that fight if he counters fire. Yep, and that is one of the issues that a lot of roguelikes can run into. That, and again, what kills variance. Now, a way to stop it is to have a greater pool of events that can show up. For instance, again, with Slay the Spire, there are multiple bosses. I would like to see them add in more bosses to the encounters, or the encounter pool. It's one of the reasons why Biome of Isaac works well on at least the regular playthrough, that they've added more bosses to that pool, despite having those fixed encounters. And again, Biome of Isaac gets by the fact that there's so many items and variants that it makes these encounters feel different. I've had Mega Saiyan runs that were by the skin of my teeth, and I've had Mega Saiyan runs that were so easy it wasn't even funny at that point. The major point is that you want to be very careful how many fixed elements are in your game. And if you do have them, are there multiple ways to get past them? But with that said, we're going to go to probably our second to last topic. We'll probably go for another 20 to 30 minutes. We'll see what happens, because I can feel my voice and hunger meter starting to drop here. But it's time to talk about persistence. Persistence is a major form of roguelite design, and we're even seeing elements of it in roguelike games. Let's talk about persistence here. Persistence is, like I said, the act of adding carryover or a change to a run. And there's two distinct groupings of persistent elements. You have persistence that changes the game going forward, and you have persistence that adds to the game or adds to the player. So, Binding of Isaac is the pitch perfect example of changes to the run. As every one of you who's played the game knows, as you get further in the Binding of Isaac and unlock more stuff, it adds more to the procedural nature to the game. As we've been talking about over the last 20-30 minutes with the Binding of Isaac, new bosses, new rooms that can show up, new events, new items, this is all persistence. It changes how the game is played. And this is a key point about Slay the Spire. That, well, not as much, but Slay the Spire adds in new cards. And the point about persistence, and this is our major example here, is that with persistence along this kind, how run 1 plays is going to be different from run 10. It's going to be different from run 50. Now, different doesn't necessarily mean easier. We can also say it makes the game harder. Again, Binding of Isaac adds in elite enemies. You can add in new challenges that can show up, new events. But the key point about persistence along these lines is that as I play this game, I am getting more stuff that's going to change things going forward. Monolith does this with the unlocks of keywords and weapons. And again, typically, these can be both soft and hard elements. Because adding in new room layouts would be a soft element. Adding in brand new challenges or systems would be a hard one. Now, the other side of persistence, and this is what roguelites make extensive use of, is progression. In Rogue Legacy here, every time I die, persistent element is in the form of gold. By using the gold, I unlock new things that are going to make my character stronger, or I can level up, which raises its stats. So, persistence in a roguelite is designed to inherently supplement my ability, but at the same time, it's going to allow me to get further and further. And as we said earlier, you have to be careful when it comes to this kind of persistence, because roguelites are inherently balanced, and unless you are a super pro player, you're going to have to rely on the persistent elements in order to win. For instance, if I start the game and I only have 20 points of health, and the enemies at the halfway point do 60 points of health, or 60 points of damage, it's going to be very hard to win, unless I do enough persistent elements or enough persistence to raise my level up to compensate. And let me check my notes here. And this is often a problem that we've ran into with a lot of games, that the persistence is so important that it basically it overtakes player skill. Like when we were playing Gemcraft. In Gemcraft, there are levels that I don't think it's possible to win unless I grind enough skill points and talismans to compensate. In a better world, persistence gives me more value. It gives me more things to do in this game. You mean Gemcraft? Yeah, I feel the same way if you're talking about that one. Now, in a lesser example of persistence, we can go back to a game like FTL, where adding in a new ship is a major form of persistence, but it's not 100% changing the actual run itself or what's going on. Once I make my choice, I'm still dealing with the same soft and hard elements. But that choice at the beginning is huge. In Hades is a good example. Choosing the sword, the shield, the bow, the gun, that radically changes how I'm going to approach that game. The same thing with the characters in the Bind of Isaac. But once I've made that choice, the run is kind of going to play out as it would. Same thing for the characters in Enter the Gungeon. And again, good persistence is basically taking something great and making it better. Bad persistence is taking something horrible and making it either adequate or overpowered. A easy way for any designer watching this to tell when you have persistence is when a game, again, features a carry-over currency or element that is then used. I almost said Dark Cells. I just made a new game. Dead Cells has its cells that you can pick up. Gemcraft has the skill points and the talismans, as well as the shadow cores. It's essentially premium currency. We want to use the free-to-play terminology of it. But persistence is something that I think you need to think about more and more with roguelike design. But it is something that, again, persistence is something that I feel more roguelike and roguelike, or just roguelikes in general, Sleepy Isaac, need to think about. Because it's a way of creating a sense of, kind of a sense that your runs are connected. The only exception is if your game has so much in terms of hard and soft elements that you don't need to add anything more to the game, or you don't need to have unlocks in that regard. And now for a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. Going forward, all Patreon supporters will get early access to our videos. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, link down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. One of the things that the game does to add in more persistence to the game is give you greater challenges to go after, and this is kind of the Hell Pack system. Now, because I was playing the game on Hell mode here, it means I'm forced to use this right from the get-go. But what this does is that as I play the game, in order to unlock more stuff or to make more use of persistence, I have to make the game harder. And this just creates, again, this ever-growing scale that the more I play, the more stuff becomes unlocked or changes that will then change how I play it. I would add that if Hades wants to really go at it, to add in more events that can show up, or more things that can grow. They already have more Fury fights, but I hope they do more with the bosses, or again, more biomes. Ultimately, the point about persistence is that the more I play, the more the game grows. But at the same time, I shouldn't feel like I'm being hamstrung by the design at the beginning. To put it simply, it should work like this. I should have a credible or a respectable chance of beating the game on run 1. Now, that doesn't mean every player is going to do that. Again, a lot about roguelike and roguelike design is about learning the game. But the game should present a viable run from the get-go. Even if I'm not able to win that game, it shouldn't be inherently weighted against me. And that, again, is the problem with when games go too far into persistence. That it's a case of, I literally can't win unless I hit level 60. Or the real game, or I don't have a real shot of winning until I'm level 50. Because if that's the case, what's the point of playing the game from 0 to 49? So I want, for our final topic here, I want to talk again about the argument about the terminology, because it's a very valid one, even though a lot of people use this to troll. Should games like the Binding of Isaac, Spelunky, Dead Cells, Enter the Gungeon, and so on be called roguelikes? Or should this term, or should the term roguelike be only defined to games in the classical sense of the genre? Again, games that are meant to mirror or emulate Rogue or NetHack. Right here is Cogmine, and this is a game that would most definitely fit the definition of a roguelike. It's isometric, it's turn-based, you're dealing with like a grid-based movement system. And this argument, I think, is very open-ended in this regard. Because as we've seen before, especially with the term Metroidvania, as time goes on, these terms become a popular part of our vernacular. And the genre or the definitions loosen up as more people approach it. For those of you watching this right now, whether it's live or recorded, here's a question for you. What is the first game that you played that you would consider to be a roguelike? If I wanted to be, if I were going with the more modern definition of it, I would say my first roguelike would be Binding of Isaac. But if I was talking about the classical term, I would hardly say it would be Shiren the Wanderer was my first actual roguelike experience. And I even said in my article that most people will either name drop Spelunky, FTL, or the Binding of Isaac. I didn't play Rift Dungeon. But again, it raises this point, and here's another question. Do you think roguelike and roguelite are enough terms? Do you think we need a third subgenre? Maybe rogue adjacent or rogue inspired? And again, a lot of people will use this to troll, but it is a valid point, because it gets at what you're trying to define your game as. Because if I say my game is a roguelike, I expect there to be a heavy focus on procedural generation and a high amount of variance. If I say it's a roguelite, then I expect a lot of persistence, I expect carryover, and I expect more in terms of that kind of growth over the course of playing the game. The problem, of course, is that if we make the term too specific, then it becomes a case of, is a roguelike if it's specifically isometric, using hex-based movement, it must always be a WeGo system, and there must always be a random endpoint. And again, like, a lot of people will use this to troll, but I mentioned it on the chat yesterday, and you are just in time for me to collapse out of hunger, too, Foreign. Rogue Dark, Dark Rogue, Souls Rogue, Light Souls Rogue. But the point is that one of the things I feel the game industry needs to do is to, take terms and definitions a little bit more seriously. Because it's the only way we can really start to have, standards and foundations. I don't know if I would argue that a rogue, like I said this on one of my posts, I think AC was the one who commented on this, or Xenorogue, or one of them said this, that I don't know if I would only classify roguelikes being turn-based these days. Like, I feel like the genre has grown, or the subgenre has grown enough that there's more to it than that. And that's actually a really good one. Action roguelike, real-time roguelike could also be really used there. And like I said, it's important to understand what kind of game you're making, because that's not going to be how you're going to bill it or pitch it to your audience, but also how you're going to focus on that design. And it does stand, and maybe at some point we will have to come up with a more standard definition for Metroidvania as well. Maybe turn-based roguelike and action roguelike. Those are some really good things. I'm going to have to mark that down for when I write the book, because it is important to be able to define these games. And we've come such a long way from the original Rogue and NetHack. I think roguelikes will continue in popularity. And that actually takes me to, that's actually a good point about wrapping things up. Roguelike design really exploded over this past decade, thanks to Binding of Isaac, Spelunky, FTL there. And the very best roguelike, I think Foreign's beating me to the punch here, the reason for their popularity is that they provide a lot of value over very short runs, which also make them very popular for the mobile and casual audience. And we've seen a lot of roguelike based games be moved over to the mobile space. Now you have to be careful. Oh, I just thought of something. Going back to Shark's point about games that have roguelike elements but aren't roguelikes, Darkest Dungeon would be an example of that. Darkest Dungeon features a lot of persistent elements to it, but it's not really focused on the rogue side of things. The rogue nature is there kind of as the punishment mechanic and to pad the game out. And you have to be careful about length when it comes to roguelikes like that. Because like we said, very best roguelikes are built around a very reliable runtime. I would argue at most an hour is a good amount for a run. If they become too long, it becomes, I think, too much of a frustration when you lose. And unless we're talking about like hardcore Iron Man loving fans. Again, I've played Grim Dawn for 60 hours with a character who could die at any minute, just like Dark Souls, or I'm sorry, Diablo. Darkest Diablo. And we're seeing more games embrace roguelike elements, again, with examples such as the Darkest Dungeon. That ability to make each run or each play feel different and give the player, again, a new experience, it can't be beat in terms of replayability. But with that said, though, there is a huge difference between the very best and the very worst examples of it. And this is why I really want to put, I think, book number 3, or write it, around roguelike design. Because again, people will assume that a roguelike is nothing more than just take 50 different levels, shovel them up in a grinder, put in your game, you have the next best-selling roguelike. It doesn't work like that. You need to understand the control, or what the algorithm that you need to design, and you need to build enough content to make it be, or to give it that variance that we need. And even with that said, though, we could even go forward having more persistent elements in it. But I think that is all I have to say on the topic. I'm starting to feel the roguelike haze. I should have brought more food and drink items with me before I start our little talk here. Thank you everybody for watching this. If you have a suggestion for our next lecture, let me know. For anyone watching this recorded, if you would like to get the ad-free and uncut version of this talk, it will be $5 or more for the Patreon. All our VIP subscribers will get that. But I'll get this posted in cut version in the near future, probably in the next week or so. Thank you everybody for watching. Come back for our regular streams later tonight for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where is in the art and science of games. And again, if you have any questions about roguelike, like, and whatever design, let me know in the comments below. Maybe we'll answer them in the future. But have a great night, folks, and I will see you later. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.